Prader-Willi syndrome. How many of you guys think that obesity is genetic? Show of hands. Okay, so obesity, about 5% of obesity can be attributed to obesity-related genes. Prader-Willi syndrome is one of those that adds into the obesity-related genotype. It was named after, it's funny because it was named after 3 endocrinologists. So how many names are there? So it was Andrea Prader, Alexis Labhart, and Heinrich Willi. They were the first to report the pattern. So sometimes in very historical endocrine books, you'll see all 3 of the names. It would say Prader-Labhart Willi syndrome, but for the most part, Labhart gets thrown under the bus. So they first noticed these symptoms and called it this syndrome. And then they were further developed in the late 60s. And I believe that Prader and Willi had a much more characterized syndrome, so they were identified, and it was a differential diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome. So, as I said, it's genetic. It's a rare neurodevelopmental disease. About 1 in 15,000 people have it, and it affects the genetic. The genetic component is a lack of expression of paternally, so it's one of the ones that aren't blamed on moms. Paternally derived imprinted material, specifically on chromosome 15, and it's the Q11 to Q13, so that's where the location is. It's that section, those 3 parts of the gene are deleted. And so it leads to a disorder of the appetite, growth, metabolism, cognitive function, and behavior. Sometimes the entire chromosome 15 is missing, but really it's generally that little portion. And the major component that leads to the disorder is a dysregulated hypothalamus. So it's kind of feelings of hunger and satiety. That was the initial diagnosis. Now it's less hunger and absence of satiety. So you never get satiated. So they need more food than their peers because they are feeling, they psychologically want more food because they're never feeling satiated, but they have less muscle and bone or fat-free mass, so really they need less. So that's the obesity aspect of it. You can get a Prader-Willi type syndrome if you have some sort of, after birth, it's not genetic, if you have something that happens to the hypothalamus, the same kind of issue arises. There's distinct facial features that Prader and Willi found. Almond-shaped eyes, narrow nasal bridge, a narrow forehead, and thin downturned lips are the facial features. There's also mild to moderate intellectual disability. At birth, severe hypotonia. So they're unable to move because of very, very low muscle tone. The hyperphagia and risk of obesity that we typically think about when we have to lock the cabinets does not appear until about age 2 or greater. Initially, the hypotonia and just a phenotype that is just non-developmental is characterized as failure to thrive, which we'll talk about in a minute. So because they have that failure to thrive in the initial growth, shorter stature, they have small hands and feet, increased body fat in all stages of development, specifically around the abdomen, butt, and thighs, and decreased lean mass, bone mineral content, and bone density. Some other characteristics are temperature sensitivity, difficult in regulating, as you would think, because the hypothalamus, they have a high pain threshold, which is interesting to me. Delayed puberty because of the different growth characteristics, and especially hypogonadism, again, thyroid, behavioral problems, very, very severe temper tantrums and OCD, and a lot of times the temper tantrums center around food because they want food. So again, the obesity that's associated is partially because of the genetic component, but partially because of the behavioral characteristics. So there's 3 distinct phases. That failure to thrive phase that I said the infants are floppy, lethargic, they don't have good suckling, they have a weak cry, very slow to develop motor skills, can't sit up, so the muscle tone is affected. And then that sets the scene for the next one, setting the scene of the toddler phase. The parents find it difficult because the kids are small and tend to overfeed them, and the kids don't move around a lot, and really have to work hard to achieve adequate nutrition. And then the hyperphagia phase, excessive eating and insatiable appetite. As the child gets older, they enter a pattern and a preoccupation with food develops. Everything is about food, increased appetite, excessive weight gain. Again, the increased appetite is based on the lack of satiety, not necessarily that they're hungry, they just can't, they will never, they don't have a stop button. So just to go over that a little bit more in detail, infant stage, failure to thrive, slower to reach milestones, and they engaging with the baby can present challenges. So as dietitians, we want to use adaptive bottles and nipples, concentrated formulas, thickening agents, sometimes even NG tubes to make sure that they're getting the appropriate nutrition without overfeeding or underfeeding. Diet management at the toddler stage sets the pattern for behavior, because if everything's a tantrum over food or trying to compensate for the failure to thrive, it sets the pattern of behavior for the years ahead. So parents of children struggle to achieve the nutrition and growth because of the stress that's associated with a slower development of the child. It can be weight controlled, and there's other carers that need to be involved in the care of these kids with a strict eating plan, despite the fact that you're limiting the calories early on, even though, as if the child is overweight, even though they're not overweight. And part of the reason is because of the lower lean mass. So muscle is less metabolically active, they need less calories. It's difficult for parents to understand that they need less calories, especially if they had a sibling that they're feeding. In primary school, the risk of obesity increases because of hyperphagia, and that also leads to behavioral problems and sometimes the inability to mainstream. One other thing that's really interesting about kids with Prader-Willi, they have a reduced ability to vomit, and feel gastric discomfort, and that goes with that pain threshold. So that Thanksgiving feeling when you eat so much food and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so full, and you almost feel like you could vomit because you're so full. They don't get that feeling. It's very strange, and they don't get that gastric discomfort where you need to unbutton your pants. So difficult to manage. And then as older adolescents and young adults, the diet management doesn't change. Still, routines need to be established, meals planned, and controlled environment. So when we talk about controlling the environment and how to treat and manage these kids, we look for a diet that has 4 key aspects. Remove temptation. So access to food has to be controlled, and that goes with the locking of the cabinets, but really kind of just understanding the limits and the barriers from early on. Sometimes you might need to lock the cupboards, fridges, and prevent access even to garbage cans. We had a Prader-Willi kid that we had to tell the parents not only to lock the cabinets, but to lock underneath the sink because the kid was eating food out of the garbage. And even at church was going in the church garbage cans. Establish good eating routines with a wide variety of healthy foods from an early age, and don't use food as reward or punishment, which we typically talk about. Quantity, highly restricted diet with lower kilocalories, so more low calorie, nutrient dense fruits and vegetables that are going to be more filling, even if that's satiety. So the quality of foods which are low in calories but nutrient dense. Because this is a genetic disorder, there's a lot of research right now, and one of the most successful so far has been oxytocin. So they had Prader-Willi rodents and noticed that one of the main things with the rodents was a decreased peripheral oxytocin. So the oxytocin neurons in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus were not firing, and so that dysregulated oxytocin signaling led to obesity in these rodents. So they gave the mice oxytocin, and they were able to manage their obesity. So they're starting clinical trials. Now oxytocin, remember, it's a hormone and it does different things, so it has to be careful. So it's in the clinical phase, but it may be able to, as it is in animals, decrease food intake and lead to weight loss because it seems to be in the regulatory pathway of satiety. And so that's how we're going to go forth managing Prader-Willis. Thank you.